would look good broken. Who knows?
Yeah, I've got a great face for a broken nose. I guess there is a compliment there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully.
But Amina, here we go then. So listen, welcome. It has actually got a name now. Cinema, Life and Everything. That is the title of the podcast. I've decided on it. And
Thank you.
welcome. And all I want to say is, how are you doing today? And if you just want to sort of have a little bit of a explain about yourself, what brings you here, what sort of stuff you're into.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for introducing me. I'm a second year film student in Farnham, obviously, as you know. And it's going pretty well. How I got here, honestly, was really just happened pretty randomly, but I'm loving it. So, yeah, second year in the UK. I just turned 20 actually last month, so that's nice. And yeah, I'm working on my documentary film right now, which is a bit scary because the difference between normal films and this is you're actually working with real people. They're not actors who you can say, oh, I need more emotion for this. Like, you really need to treat things lightly because these are people's lives. So very different, but really exciting. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to say to people who are listening in or watching in on YouTube, basically we met during a filming of, I've already had the director on there, the last 8 count, and you were very just as we mentioned as we come on in there, you were very nice in giving me a broken nose and lots of bruising and a stitched up eye from a terrible boxing bout that I'd had.
Yeah.
And we
Beautiful
just
look.
it was I've never looked better. I was ready. But during those makeup times we got into some really interesting conversations. I was like, I really would love to have you on my new podcast to talk about some of those things and also films that inspire and motivate you. So I loved your choice, but just for the people here today, what were your 3 films?
Yeah, so the choices that I have were King Kong 2004, one of my favorite films ever. Seven, which had Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, and then A Marriage Story, which recently came out a couple years ago.
Yeah.
So
it's a great mix. 2 films that I'm very into, The Marriage Story and Seven was like Seven and Fight Club sort of rewrote my life a little bit. But then King Kong, I got caught up on again and watched it the other day, and I was actually really blown away by how not misremembered it, but how much I really loved it. I was just like, and now I've found out there's a special edition in black and white that's over almost 3 hours long. So I'm really excited to watch that soon afterwards as well.
Yeah, I actually didn't know about that until recently. I haven't had the time, but I definitely love to watch that version. But the one that came out that I chose, the 2004 one, was just, I don't know what it was. I don't even know how I came about it when I was like 11, but I saw it once and I was just completely mesmerized by it. Just everything about it, from the CGI to the storyline, just everything for me at the time was just insane and really inspiring. And it just had a mix of everything that I love in film. So I guess that was probably one of like the really early stages of me realizing like I actually love movies. Like, I'd love to be in this, or I'd love to, like, as weird as it sounds, I'd love to be in that story no matter how like scary and dangerous it was. But yeah, like when I was little, like I was actually like quite obsessed with like reenacting like my favorite movies and things like that. Like, I'd run around in the garden pretending I was an avatar.
Amazing.
But I guess, I don't know, somehow it's led me here to actually making it. So yeah.
That is so interesting because it's King. I guess we're going to start with King Kong. When I was watching it back again, Peter Jackson was a massive fan of the other versions because there's lots of iconic imagery in it anyway. But what really struck me about this one, it was, like you say, it really had the fantasy element, and the story of King Kong is very timeless as well. It's just within the realms of believability, but it's got that lovely sort of storybook and tragic love story as well. It's an absolutely incredible film, so I can see how it was so inspiring for you as well.
Yeah, and I feel like there's just a lot of different elements to it, whether it be like um the main character, like Jane, and just King Kong himself, and just their entire relationship all the way through, from how it goes from her being completely terrified of him because he's just this huge gorilla
Yeah, big age.
on this island that no one knows about, and like all of the like mainland people are like worship him and are super scared of him, and they literally sacrifice her. And just the way that the relationship develops, it's so unpredictable and scary, but then by the end of it she's practically like crying because like he's being shot down at the very end on top of this tower. And like, I don't know, there's just something like extremely like odd but also like almost understandable about it at the same time. I don't know, it's very difficult to describe, and they didn't make it super obvious. Like they didn't make it about like this love story between this woman and this gorilla. It was a lot more complex than that, because
Yeah.
of all the other characters that were in it. But I don't know. I find it very difficult to like come to terms with how I feel about that relationship, because that's not a very typical human to human relationship. But
Yeah.
I don't know. It's weird, but I think it's very nice that they show how many people can think, oh, that just because there's this huge dangerous gorilla, mean just because it looks like that means that that's what it is. That's not true. Which I
Mm,
feel can also apply to people. You can always read a book, like judge a book by its cover and think, oh, that person doesn't look very nice, but until you actually get to know them and give them a chance, like they might be a hidden gem, a lovely human being. And I think that sort of applies for this relationship as well, just on a very exaggerated level.
I just, for me, the one thing that really struck me about it, and this is what I love about it as well, I think Peter Jackson, because it's almost been remade every decade in a sort of way. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess the way I would look at it is, if it you update the imagery a little, or so you update the
Mm.
effects a little bit, so people will connect with it because it looks of its
Yeah.
time. But at the same time, the tale it tells is timeless. The way of like
Mm.
commercialize it, trying to commercialize wild, and like you say, judging someone,
Mm-hmm.
and also this untamed love story, and in trying to actually do something for the right reasons, saving her, that he gets killed and stuff. As also, yeah, is it? Yeah, the monkey
Mm-hmm.
gets killed and gorilla gets killed, and it's just to get that level of emotion out of a creature that you never hear a single
Yeah.
word from. It's all just done through facial expressions
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. And even though like many people may disagree, I feel for its time, the CGI was incredible.
Yes.
Like obviously the other Avatar, I think the other Avatar came out then, or was it 2009? I'm not 100% sure,
Mm.
but for example, everyone knows Avatar for being an insane, like beautifully like made movie, especially for its effects. But I love King Kong for the same reason. Love
Yes.
both movies, but there's just something about the danger and the adventure and the relationships made in that movie, despite the fact that there's a fantastic cast and it
Yeah.
was just made in general. The CGI in that was just, it just blew me away. Like watching that on the big screen when I was little was like oh my god, wow, this looks real. Like this is
Yes.
what I'd imagine this huge monkey to look like in person. There's just so much detail to it, and I just find that amazing.
And I
So,
think
yeah.
one of the big things as well was that it wasn't just special effects for special effects sake. There was a real weight, like that it
Hmm.
felt real. It wasn't there just trying to be all you're going to see is it's effects and nothing else. You really had an emotional link. Like
Hmm.
Peter Jackson is very, very good, like with
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings and stuff as well. They'll have things that are visually unbelievable and spectacular and breathtaking, but
Yeah.
he's always remembering to link the emotion and the story to it as well. So
Yes.
even if you can, I personally thought they looked amazing as well, but even if you come back in like 30 years time, or if you watch the previous King Kong, which is all like stop motion animation, the story will
Hmm.
resonate because it's such a timeless story.
Yeah. I think it's a work of art, honestly. I could honestly talk about that movie for ages, but if
Mm.
there's the main things that I'd take away from that, it would definitely be, I don't know, as weird as it sounds, I'm just really attracted to, as you know, with our previous work on the last eight counts and all of the blood and gush and gore and all of
Yeah.
that, there's just something that really attracts me to, like, the darkness of the movie as well.
Yes.
I guess is the best way that I can put it. Despite the fact that, like, there are just obviously some very dark scenes, such as when they're like trying to fight that slug and things
Oh,
like, and
it's
all those
yeah.
spiders and things. Just horrendous, honestly, like very traumatic experiences. But like, there's just something so exciting about it, and like watching movies like that, it just kind of makes you think, like at least for me, I'd watch something like that, and that's what attracts me. It's like it doesn't matter. There doesn't have to be a hero. There doesn't have to be a protagonist. It's just the fact of like going through something so thrilling or so scary. It makes you think like, oh, are they gonna live, or gonna are they gonna get out of it? And like it's so difficult to put into words, but I'm just so attracted to
No,
that
I get it.
whole thrill of it, and that's what makes me excited about it. And so now, like being where I am now, thinking I actually may be able to create that in the future for other people, insane.
It's just
So
it's like that for me. I always talk about lowbrow art and highbrow, and I don't agree with it. I think
mhm.
when it's like what you've just said there, correct me if I'm wrong, but it makes you dream outside yourself. You see what you can
Yes,
inspire to be, and
definitely.
and the fact that some people just go on the journey, and when the film ends, they can walk away and go,
Hmm.
"Oh, that was fun," but it's inspired you that much that you want to tell your own tales as well. And I think
Yeah,
that is absolutely awesome. It's given
yeah.
you more than just the emotional lift. It's like, no, I've got to tell my stories as well.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, that's completely correct. Like, if I had the option, I'd be one of the characters in the movie. Like, it would be
Do
my
you have a
dream.
favored one? Would you want to be anyone? Does it matter or?
Ah, honestly, there's no one specific who I'd like to be. Obviously, when I was little, I'd love to be the girl and just
Yeah.
go through that whole ride of being thrown around by like dinosaurs. And even though that's horrifying, like in real life, if that were to happen, no way I would survive. But just the whole like just the whole fantasy of it, the whole mystery. I love it. It's just very fulfilling to watch and to think about. And at the time, being little, wanting to experience that sort of thing, it's like, I mean, you're a child. You don't really understand what would
Yeah.
actually happen if this were real circumstances, but it's just so fun to think about and to watch, and it's just very immersive. Just everything about it is just the way it's made is just gorgeous,
Mm.
and I could go on for ages, but those are the main
No,
solid
no,
points that
that
I
makes
could
complete
put.
sense.
But
And I think
yeah,
one of the things that really
for sure.
chimed in with me as well was that Peter Jackson was obviously a massive fan
Hmm.
of the earlier versions
Hmm.
because he pays
Yeah.
so much homage to him. He's retelling the tale in his own way, but he's also I wouldn't be surprised if I looked around that I would find out that he was probably feeling the same about the earlier version as you feel about
Hmm.
this one now, and he just wanted to
Exactly. Yeah.
retell the story because it's got that absolute like beauty about it.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
yeah. I was so thankful you mentioned it as one of your films because like I say, it made me
Hmm.
rewatch it, and I was like, wow, this was
Hmm.
absolutely incredible. I was so thank you
Yeah.
for picking that one. But
Of
okay,
course. Yeah.
you mentioned a little bit about the darker side of human nature or the darker side of tales being
Hmm.
told. So, in a terrible segue, I guess that leads us quite well to Seven,
Yes.
which is not a
Yes.
light-hearted comedy.
No, definitely not. If anything, it's just as bad in King Kong, but for different
Yeah,
reasons.
yeah, very much so.
Um, Now that I'm realizing very quickly, I've realized I've picked some very dark movies. So I wonder what that says about me. Um, but Seven, yes, very, very interesting. I only first watched it last year around this time.
Wow.
And I had no idea. Like I knew that it was a very it was a great film and people loved it, but I never realized how much of an impact it would have on me until after I'd watched it. I finished watching it and I was like, wow, I can't speak for the next 3 hours. And even though we'll talk about A Marriage Story later, it was almost similar with that as well. But I
Mm.
think one of my favorite things about Seven is probably just how, well, for one thing, just small, nothing like theoretical, but the fact that they kept the main villain like concealed and they didn't show his identity or anything like that until what was it, like halfway through or two-thirds of the
Two-thirds of the
way
way.
through the
Yeah, yeah,
film.
yeah.
And actually, not to brag, but there was one thing that really made me like confident that I was made for filmmaking. It would probably be when Brad Pitt was talking to someone on the stairs, and this photographer came down, took a quick picture of him, and ran back up or something, or ran down.
Yeah.
And I thought, and immediately I said out loud, I was watching it with a friend, and I said, "That's him." Immediately, I knew that was a villain,
Amazing.
and I already forgot his name. My gosh, I haven't watched it in a little bit, but I don't know what it was, but something just clicked in my head. I was like, "That's him."
Mm.
Like, and I didn't doubt it for a second. And then 40 minutes later, I was right, and I was like, "Oh my god, I called it." And it's I honestly was like surprised at myself that I realized it, but I just sort of took it as a yes, I'm made for filmmaking. This is fantastic. Because I got it. But I don't know. I think that it's that is a such a traumatic movie. I
Mm.
honestly couldn't speak after, like, just thinking about the concept of spoilers for anyone who hasn't
Oh, you should
watched
have
it,
watched it by
but
now. It's 90s.
yeah, but just going to the end and seeing how he'd killed his wife and he put, I think it was like her head in a box,
Yeah.
and I just saw that just in the middle of the desert too. Just seeing that, it's like you'd expect him to do bad things, especially with all the different what are the names? I forgot what they're called, but he
Sins.
uses like, yeah,
Like
all the
envy,
like the
greed,
seven deadly
yeah,
sins or
avarice.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So like obviously that was a huge theme throughout the whole thing, but seeing that at the end, it was just like I wouldn't know what to do if that were my husband, my wife, my partner. Like that
Mm.
is just the emotional impact of just the way he would string them along all the way throughout the movie. It's it's terrible, and but it's so enticing. It's so like you just have to watch it no matter how
Yes.
gruesome it gets. It's like you just want to know what happens, and the fact that he takes it that far to going straight for Brad at the end is just I have no words. And in terms of the writing and who came up with the idea, I I don't know how you'd get to that point. I find it a very interesting road to go down. And I'd
Yes.
probably look at myself differently and be like, I wonder what would make me think to come up with that. But despite how gruesome it is, obviously beautifully made, but this is probably my darkest choice for sure,
Mm.
simply just because I'd never watched a movie that had this sort of theme to it of the seven deadly sins and like him actually doing something for each one, and that was the crime for each. And I
Yes.
just really liked how they'd like every crime that they'd be working on, they'd go through that and then eventually realize, oh, it's the same person. And I feel like in real life, obviously, that's not very realistic and that's very calculated. And you need to be some sort of, I wouldn't say, I'm not really sure how to put it, but obviously, it's not a very realistic type of movie, but I just love the whole crime aspect of it, and because I actually used to want to be a detective
Oh, wow.
before
Okay. That's
I went into
interesting.
film, so watching that, I thought it was great, but then the film part of me was like, oh my gosh, that's so dramatic and so like ridiculous. So obviously it's not realistic, but I thought it was a very interesting take on crime and mixing it with different things such as religion, even though religion is not that at all. It's
No,
this guy who's just got it completely wrong. But yeah.
I do think as well, one of the most, because I got to see it in the cinema show age, but I remember exactly what you said there. At the end of it, it was silence in the cinema, like everybody was just,
Yeah.
but no one was moving. Everyone had just
Yeah.
sort of witnessed, and it was very affecting. Also, as well, we both speak about the violence and how gruesome it is,
Hmm.
but you only ever see the violence after the fact. You never see
Yeah.
really an act of violence being committed. It's just
Yeah.
the that which in a way is even
Yeah.
worse because it's making your mind fill in the
Hmm.
gaps and stuff as well.
Yeah.
It's a but I think one of the things that always sticks with me as well, again, super spoilers here, so the original ending was that after Brad Pitt, when he shoots the guy, it's silence and you see him in the back of the car and the door shuts and it just goes to black and the credits come up. But
Hmm.
they really had to fight because at one point it was going to have the day saved and stuff like that, and he wasn't going to kill the killer. But yeah, to deal with the
Yeah.
fact that the killer actually wins, and it
Hmm.
I think that's what makes it so memorable as well, that
Yeah.
there is no happy ending with that one.
Yeah, and I think that's it's obviously nice for an audience to have a happy ending, but at the end of the day, this is nothing like a Disney movie. Um,
Yes.
and I think that it's very refreshing every once in a while to watch a movie that doesn't have a happy ending, simply because even though the story itself isn't realistic, in terms of real life, I feel like
Mm,
not everything in your life, every circumstance has a good like outcome to it. And so I think at least for me it's a little refreshing to watch a film and not be perfectly happy by the ending and more, even though it's not great to feel unhappy or whatever after a film, it's good to watch and be like, actually, it makes you think and it makes you feel
yes.
something instead of just, oh yay, the problem's fixed. Instead, it's a you actually think about what happened. You think about the choices that they made when filming, and just killing him off at the end. Okay, sure, he could be dead and the problem could be over, but at the same time, Brad is left with no partner, and
Mm,
he ended up finishing his seven deadly sins or whatever it was,
yeah.
and it was almost like as if the killer was just happy, like he had done his job, he did what he wanted to do. And
Yes.
so I honestly, at least from if I were the killer in that film, it seems like he wouldn't even mind being killed because he like went through with his
Yes.
crime, with his motive. He actually finished his own like terrible project, his own like agenda of just this madness, I guess. And I mean, I guess for him, he'd probably feel very fulfilled.
Yes.
But that leaves the main protagonist alone and almost, at least for me, I'd feel still very guilty and almost like a failure because of that outcome.
Well, something
So,
that's really sort of sticking with me now, hearing you talk and what we've actually spoken about before this podcast, was both these films, even though they have their fantastical elements, they're very much
mhm,
based in authenticity. And
yeah.
it doesn't have, like you say, sometimes the happy ending, as refreshing and as sort of like uplifting it would be, and not giving you that, it's sometimes you need that sort of downbeat ending because there
Hmm.
is that sense that the killer had already outwitnessed the police, and there was
Yeah.
also in King Kong that the gorilla's never going to be able to go back home. There's this lovely idea
Hmm.
that it's the doomed love, and in a way with
Yeah.
Brad Pitt, he's quite an idealistic Detective Mills is quite an idealistic policeman at the beginning, and and
Mhm.
Morgan Freeman's more world weary, but in the end it's Morgan
Yeah.
Freeman that knows that this is how it must end.
Yeah.
So do you think that informs the stories you want to tell as well, that even though you have these wanting to aspire to build these big characters, to seek the truth and the authentic in whatever story,
Mhm.
however like unpleasant that might be sometimes?
Honestly, yes, and I feel like no matter how fun it may be to cast actors and go through with a fiction film, even if it doesn't have a happy ending and getting emotions out of actors and things like that, that's great. But not to go off on a huge tangent, but
No, go off on them.
um, if I've learned anything already through documentary, it's that filming real people and actually getting real stories and working on that is a lot more fulfilling in terms of how authentic you want a film to
Mhm.
be, because you're not like, let's say you're filming a documentary and you have a specific story from someone that you want to get and you want to tell, but then let's say at the end of the interview you ask, oh, is there anything else, and they go off and tell you this amazing story that happened. You just have to keep going with it, because what's the point if you just stop there? You might as well continue the journey and maybe discover something which is real and has happened to real people,
Yes.
and get that story as well, or just completely start over with that. I just feel like, even though I was never a huge fan of documentary in the past, there's a real, just, if we're talking about authenticity, there's nothing more genuine and authentic than finding real people who
Yes.
are okay with being on screen in front of camera, because they're not being paid and they're talking about their own experiences, or they're actually living it while you're filming. And so obviously there's a huge difference between actors and people who are being filmed for a documentary, but and there's great things about both. And I really think it's crazy how well actors can actually bring out their own emotions. So complete respect to that. Um, but I think there's nothing more emotional or like touching for me than watching or filming or speaking to people, even if it's not film related, just speaking to people in real life and seeing how their face changes when they're talking about something.
Yes.
That's the real emotion. That's the real story. Those are the real, like, feelings. And I don't really think that film would be as popular as it is if it didn't make people feel things. And at least for me, the main reason why I love film is simply because whenever I was little watching King Kong, it made me feel things. And even if I'm watching something like Seven and I'm traumatized by the end of it, at least
Mhm.
it makes me think, and it bothers me, but I'm okay with that, because it's like, oh, how can someone do this? But oh, this person feels really bad, blah blah blah, whatever. It just, I feel like watching films that make you think, no matter how they make you, like, if they make you feel good, bad, it doesn't matter. But the fact that there's emotions present in someone after watching a piece of like visual media, I just think that's really powerful. And to have the skill to do that is amazing. So
it's it's no matter what story you're telling, and whether it's an authentic story of like a
yeah.
documentary, or if you're looking at the face of a CGI monkey, if you
Hmm.
have that trueness of emotion, and even in documentaries you have to edit them in a certain way so the story
Yeah.
resonates correctly.
Yeah.
But I think you're saying about feeling, but also it makes you question, what if you
Yeah.
were Jane in King Kong? What if you were King
Yeah.
Kong? What would you do if you were faced with the situation that you realize that the killer had put your wife or your partner's head in a box? You know,
Yeah.
it's the acting, or
Hmm.
whatever, or if it's a documentary, it's having the edit in the story that you
Hmm.
feel that pull. And although you might not exactly have ever been in that situation or will ever be in that situation, there is something about the human nature. Like for Seven, for me, it's always in that last moment. It's the moment
Yeah.
of forgiveness, or the moment of control, or the moment of you can't let the bad guy win. King Kong is just all about love. It's a love story at the end of the day, and how to be able, and like you say, it just to have that thing that, and at the end of a written script, and you've watched it filmed on screen, and it leaves you, you feel concussed, you can't move out of the seat, and you're just thinking about it for day afterwards. That is, I think, what everyone aspires to, no matter on what level of the artist we are. That's the creative experience.
Yeah, definitely. I don't, even though I may be studying film, there's still a part of me that just doesn't understand how someone can create such a script and
Yes.
and then it eventually, over years of production and money and time and effort from people, it creates something that, sure, it can be successful, but even if it's not successful in Hollywood or whatever, the fact that people eventually, from it goes from words on a script to visuals on screen to emotions in a person, just that whole cycle, I think, it's amazing. But I also still try to wrap my head around
Yeah.
how some people can just do that so well. And obviously it takes a huge crew, it takes a ton of time and resources, but the fact that all of these films, there's been thousands of films made, but the fact that there can be so many films that have done that and impacted people in one way or another
Yes.
is just, it's lovely, and it's inspiring. It brings hope to people. I'd hope so, at least it does for me, which I think is just really nice, because a lot of people can just think, oh, film movies, it's just entertainment. But what is entertaining? It's the fact that there's a great story on screen or one of your favorite actors. Okay, sure, but it's entertaining because it makes you feel something, and that's just
Yes.
sort of my favorite part about film, just in general. So
That's an incredible way of putting it as well. And yeah, I've often had that thought as well, that if you take it from the first point, someone will have an emotion. And then if we're talking about a film rather than a documentary, but even with a documentary, like the documentary maker will have an emotion thinking about something and says, okay, I need to get a lot of other people that this has happened to, and they'll start to create like that. Or someone who's writing a script, they'll think of something in their lives, or they'll have a thought, and that will give them an emotion. It gets written down, and then you say it gets edited, it gets processed, then it gets given over to actors who then read their ways into it and then create the characters like that. Then the director films it, then the film gets edited. But there's this emotion, this energy that gets carried throughout it, and eventually when you're viewing it, it may be something completely different from what the original script intended, but there's energy, there's emotion traveling through it. And I mean, how many stories are there? But yet thousands, hundreds of thousands of films are made each year. I think it's phenomenal. And yeah, the reason why I love cinema so much and create this podcast, really. And honestly, one of my favorite is a different word, I'd say. Definitely one of the most emotional films I've watched in the last few years that had issues close to both of us. So I mean, yeah, would you the third film, A Marriage Story, we should talk about this a little bit, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. Despite the fact that this is a couple that was actually in film, which I thought was pretty cute at first, there's so much which affected me personally, at least because of my life and how my parents split and everything. But even if you don't have divorced parents or um, seriously bad marital issues, I feel like this film really accurately represents um, just how difficult and how toxic certain relationships can get, whether it be, and not that people are toxic on purpose, but that sometimes life just takes you in a way that in down a road that you never thought you'd go to, which sometimes can just be really, really upsetting and traumatic. But and watching that film, halfway through I was like, I don't know if I can finish this. But because it is a lot. But honestly, like obviously a fantastic cast, and they all did amazing, but there is, I think it depends on how much you're able to take as a viewer,
Yeah,
emotionally, because obviously, like I've spoken already on how much I love to be affected emotionally by films, but obviously, depending on how much one is able to take, obviously it can get very overwhelming. And I feel like if there's any film that can do that very well, it's this one,
yeah,
which is why I respect it, honestly. Even though it's not one of my favorite films, I'd say it's probably one of the most impactful films that I've watched, simply because of just the nature of trying to like remake something that's so common and happens so often
yeah.
in so many households.
And you mentioned about authenticity in a documentary as well. At some points, that really does feel like watching a documentary.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really hits home. I think for me, the biggest thing in rewatching it was how both the main characters, they build up to the point of where they are now, and you can see they fell in
Mhm.
love, but they've become strangers to each other, and just
Yeah.
that anger at each other, but also anger at themselves that they've allowed the relationship to become like this. It's
Mhm.
it's note perfectly written, like I've read the script as well, and note perfectly acting as well, because there's no main bad guy. There are dramatic scenes, but it all feels real.
Mhm.
It all feels very, very authentic. And yeah, it's a horror film in its own way, but it's also in a weird sort of way very beautiful, because it's very, very true, and you can see
Mhm.
yourself in the characters. Or I saw my parents quite a lot in them as well, to be quite honest. So it was a,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a hell of a watch.
Yeah. And like personally, at least for me, like I had never been in that specific type of position of like, for example, like their son, I think it was, like
Mm,
I'd never been through that specific type of divorce, let
mm.
I'd say. But because mine happened very early on when I was a baby, basically, with my parents. But I was actually talking about it with my mom yesterday,
Oh wow.
and she was because I told her, I was like, yeah, like I'm doing this tomorrow, kind of nervous. and she told me that she watched like a little bit of the beginning and the end and like some things she saw on YouTube. I was like, Mom, just don't finish it. And she was like, it seems very toxic. I was like, yes, Mom, it is. And I was like, and we actually talked a little bit about this as well, sort of like what we're talking about. And I don't know, it was just like personally, I think it was good for me to watch because even though everyone's situation is completely different and unique, I think just as a whole, the film does a very good job on like just showing normal human relationships and the unfortunate side of how things eventually turn out. Obviously, not every single couple is saying, um, is like screaming at each other and cheating on each other and doing all these things, but to a certain extent, every relationship has issues. And I think it does a really good job, especially with just how there can just be complete silence in some scenes. And it that's all that's needed. There's no words that need to be spoken. There's no arguments that need to be had. You can just tell by the way the actors look at each other, what they're thinking, how they're feeling about each other, simply because of how they built up the story and the specific conversations and the types of language and tone that they use. Just
Yes.
just the very humanistic, just I don't know, it's just they've done a very good job with making their specific situation and their feelings towards each other just so crystal clear. And even though it may be a very extreme version of a relationship, it's for some people that's very realistic and has happened, unfortunately, to many people on earth. But
Mm.
obviously there's tons of people who have had a lot less of a dramatic version of that. But even if you've never experienced a divorce or even a relationship, I think that it does a very, very good job at just showing how unfortunate some things can turn out. Obviously, not that that's a good thing, but just that there's a real attention to detail when it comes to how people interact each other with each other when certain things like this go wrong, and how people and their relationships change over time, and how it's like, who are you anymore? Like, you're
Yes.
not the person I used to be with. And how have I blinked my eyes and we're just in a completely different place, and we're completely different people, and we don't even feel the same way about each other anymore. And it's very sad, but very, very powerful. So,
I think for me as well that when so many films are this sort of love affair, and they get, they meet each
yeah.
other and then they go for the trouble in middle, and then they get the end, and the end is happily ever after. But this actually deals with
Hmm.
the fact, well, maybe happily ever after doesn't always happen. And I love the
Yeah.
fact that, spoilers, they don't reunite
Hmm.
at the end. They go on to their own lives, and in a way they find a peace with each other. And
Yeah.
again, we've gone back to this thing that you've said, and I think it's not seeking out misery for misery's sake when you're watching a film, but
Yeah.
again, something that's very authentic and true. And art doesn't always have to be nice, it doesn't always have to be in a pretty package, but it has to feel that there's something there that resonates.
Exactly. Yeah. And just going back to that whole thing about emotion, even though obviously, even though I do enjoy like films making you feel certain ways, just because I may pick some really dark films doesn't mean I want to be upset or anything. But it's the fact that, like, what's the saying? Like, you're never going to know what it feels to be happy unless you've gone through sad
Yes.
times, for example. So, watching films that make you feel some way, or watching, let's say, labeled as darker films, that can almost, in a way, maybe make some people's situations maybe clearer to themselves. Like, sure,
Yes.
maybe let's say you've had a terrible divorce and you watch A Marriage Story. Sure, it may not make you feel good in the moment. Obviously, everyone's completely different, but it's almost like, actually they did a really good job with this. And even though it's really sad and really depressing, it's accurate. And even though it's obviously everyone's relationships are completely unique, it's almost like I'm not really alone in this, whether it be from also being another little kid who wants to be in a King Kong
Yeah.
film, or in an Avatar movie or something like that, or really into crime with Seven. um just, it doesn't matter what type of film it is, but you can watch something, and especially when it comes to relationships, films like this, it's like, actually, I'm not alone in this. Other people have experienced this too. And I see the pain in the actors' faces, and they do it beautifully.
Mm.
And I've felt that way before, or I've felt this angry before, or I've felt this happy before, or it really doesn't matter what emotion it is. It's just the fact that films are able to bring up emotions, and even maybe bring a little bit of comfort, showing that actually this has happened more than just in this film or in this specific
Yes.
case. And it's, I feel like it would be nice to just watch something and be like inspired, or even just to feel some comfort from it, just to know like I'm not the only one who's experienced this. So,
Yeah. I
yeah.
think that's so true as well. And having the courage, that I'm very happy that these sort of stories still get made and told as well. The scariest thing for me that
Hmm.
censorship would happen, or all art just becomes nice. It's like you say, you don't always have to seek out depression. I know King Kong has a tragic ending, but there's lots of thrilling moments in it. It's very fantastical. The
Hmm.
CGI is incredible. It makes you believe to be higher than yourself. But I,
Hmm.
I think the worst thing for me, even if I completely disengage with a film, I don't enjoy it, at least I've had a strong feeling. The worst thing for me would be to watch something for a few hours and just not remember it 2 minutes later. Like, it would be,
Yeah.
it's like that for me is the biggest waste of time, of resources. And, people
Hmm.
put their effort into playing the characters, directing it, editing
Hmm.
it. And it's just like, yeah, that was nice. I'd rather someone
Yeah.
completely hate it, or like not, like not, like Marriage Story. I'll be honest, I tried to watch it again, and there's a few bits coming, and I was just like, I'm
I don't
just
want to
go.
see this
I'm going to
again.
pause it for a minute and walk on. It's like, and
Yeah.
for me, it's not. Everyone always remembers there's a big scene in it for people who haven't seen it, where Adam Driver proper
He's
loses
like
his,
screaming at
yes,
Scarlett
punches his
Johansson.
hand into the wall. But there's bits far worse than that. I think like I say, there's just a bit where they're in bed together, and Scarlett Johansson just looks at him like, "Who are you?" And he's just become
Yeah.
so selfish and self-absorbed, and he's just thinking about what happens to his career. And I was like, "Oh
Yeah.
man, don't you see what you're doing?" So yeah, incredible
Mhm.
film. But wow, yeah, no, not a laugh riot.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just while you were speaking about that, not to not to be rude to ads and people who make a living from making ads, but I think that's one of the reasons I literally just thought of this now of why people just hate ads, whether it be on like when you're about to watch a YouTube video and you have to wait for the two ads to play, or you've got commercials going on like in the middle of your TV show or whatever. It's because they just don't make you feel a certain type of way. It's just kind of like trying to sell a product or just talk about some random, I don't know, gym equipment that you don't need. And it's like, this just doesn't like appeal to me, even if it is something
You've
that
just
you
revealed
need.
what the algorithm thinks you want now.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Now maybe they're gonna start making super emotional ads and make all of us cry.
I think for me, if I see one more advert for Huel, I'll go insane. They should give me a royalty check now every time I go on YouTube. But do you
uh,
know what you you said something there that really really sort of resonated with me actually. That um none of those three films. All right, the music in King Kong is quite grandiose, but that plays into what sort of film it is. But I don't know if you feel this as well, but I hate when it feels like I'm being led in a film. This is how you need to feel now. This is the reaction you should have, and the music swells and it closes up on the face in a certain way, and you're like, oh, that's all you can feel and only you can feel. I like all of these three films are quite open to interpretation. You can side with a monkey, or you can side with Aidan Brody or Naomi Watts. I'm not saying anyone's going to be into what John Doe is doing, but the idea of sin, and do the people that are getting murdered, do they deserve it in some way? And also, Marriage Story is very. You could side with Adam Driver's character if you wanted, but at both points they sort of exhibit behavior that isn't great. So do you feel that as well, that in art it's nice not to be led and just tell the story and let people take what they want from it, and because that's what encourages questioning and debate.
no, yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. Like, for example, like the music in King Kong, so dramatic, but but I think it works for the film, as you said, but I completely agree. And that's why I think experimental film is
Yes.
becoming a lot more popular, just because just and Seven as well, I'd say, is quite a big twist. Well, actually, no, not Seven, sorry. Fight Club. That's
Yes.
why so many people are just enthralled by Fight Club, is because you just never see the ending coming. And it's just like a slap in the face. It's just a complete shock and you wouldn't expect it. And then you're just kind of left there like, wait, what? There's no way. And then you just kind of have to sit with that, and then by the time the movie's done and the credits are rolling, you're just still thinking about it again, which I think is nice. But yeah, when it comes to certain films, I had one in mind. I just can't put my finger on that now. um but oh yes, that's what it was, like rom-coms, for example.
Yeah.
Tons of people love rom-coms,
Yeah.
and I get why they're popular, I get why they're fun, but the more I educate myself in film, the more I go to class, the more films that I watch which are more abstract or experimental, the more I dislike typical mainstream filmmakings,
Mm.
such as specifically rom-coms, because even though I used to love them, now it's just sort of it almost has like its own algorithm, its own storyline, which is the same thing. It's always either there's two people who hate each other and then they fall in love, or like there's just, I it's just like for some reason I'm not going to name any specific rom-coms, but I've just you at least for me, I just can't watch them anymore simply because I know within the first 10 minutes
How
of
what's gonna
watching
yeah.
the ending to be. Yeah, and even if the music is fine, even if the acting is great, um, it's just it's just not for me because if it's labeled if I go to Netflix and I see rom-com, no thanks. Simply because I probably have either already watched it or it's a remake of something which is already very similar. There's just I don't know, I just not to hate on rom-coms because I know that they're really fun and they're entertaining for a night,
Yeah, you know
but
something.
um it's just you just always see what's coming, at least for me, and
Yeah.
there's no real thrill in it. There's no real questions. It's just sort of a, as I mentioned before, like almost like Disney movie sort of happy ending, which is fine from time to time, but it just never really makes me think much. And if it's just purely based on romance and relationships and gossiping, it's not personally my favorite
Yeah.
thing to watch. There needs to be some sort of mix.
It just it's sort of very pre-packaged, pre-presented.
Yeah.
You're in it for 90 minutes and then it's done and you never think about it again. But I actually
Mhm.
think you mentioned about music. I've just thought about it now. Seven and Marriage Story is
Mhm.
very, very minimal background music.
Mhm.
It isn't doesn't really tell you how to think. The major thing in Seven, apart from they do a few like drone noises, is just the sound of rain throughout the film.
Yeah.
And Marriage Story, apart from a couple of like little bits that I think start and end the film, and apart from when
Mhm.
characters might actually be singing in the film, there's
Mhm.
virtually any music, which again lends it to that. We've come back to documentaries, that sort of documentary
Yeah.
feel again. Like you're not being told how to feel. But in a way, don't you feel that makes the films even more dramatic? Because now we're
Yeah.
talking, there's no music playing in the background. This
Mhm.
is real life, and that sort of sense, like, oh my god, I'm actually very, very immersed in it now.
Yeah, definitely. I think with Marriage Story, that's what I loved. Like just the awkward silence and not even
Mm,
awkward, it's just tension. Like
yes.
just when you realize you don't need music for certain times and the like sure music can make things either easier to watch or more interesting or add a little bit to a scene, but for example in the Marriage Story specifically, it's so powerful because the longer there's silence and the more the camera just focuses on their facial expressions, that's all you need, and that just makes it even more unsettling, even more stressful.
Mm,
And it just that does personally a lot more, I'd say, for an audience, and that forces you to pay attention to all the little details in comparison to having music in the background. And obviously, background music is a fantastic tool to have, but when it comes to specific either scenes or movies such as that, I think it's a very, very good choice and very
mm.
powerful if used correctly, to just have silence and to just let the camera roll and show what's going on. Um, so
Again, it
yeah,
comes back to that authenticity
Mhm.
in life. We don't. It's not always. You're not always told how to feel. It's not wrapped up in a pretty bow. Sometimes all
Yeah.
you get is the silence, and it's up to you now. You decide how you're going to feel, or if you're feeling
Mhm.
uncomfortable. And yeah, it's a very, very true statement. I completely agree. It's a yeah, amazing point you make there. So I was going to say, is there anything coming up soon that you're developing? Or I mean, you've mentioned about a documentary. Is there anything you can talk about now, or do you have to keep it quiet at
Yeah.
the moment?
Yeah, I've actually spoken about documentary way more than I probably should have. So
No, not
sorry
at
for going off on that.
spoilers.
um, but yeah, right now I'm just finishing off an essay and then I'm getting on with my documentary, which is about 10 minutes long. And I won't say too much about it because we are still in the very early stages. But I'm just really excited to actually work with real people for a change instead
Yes.
of casting actors. Not that I don't love working with actors,
Don't
because I think
worry.
it's
It's
great.
not.
So,
I'm also
but
a real person.
yeah, I just think it'll be a refreshing change for sure. And honestly, there's a little part of me which thinks that I might end up liking documentary a lot more than I originally had planned.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's a lot. I'd say, yeah, the last thing I was just gonna say is that I think I'm a little bit scared to do it, honestly,
Mm.
because I feel like it's just gonna make me realize, actually, I'm so obsessed with the authenticity of filming real people and getting their unplanned, like unscripted
Mm.
emotion and just words, just everything in general. Um, and I feel like there's a little part of me which could honestly just fall in love with it, because I've never been a huge fan of documentary, if I'm being honest, simply just because I just like, at least from things that I'd seen before, it was never really of my interest.
Mm.
But since starting this unit, I've actually watched a few films which have really just been very, very powerful, very
Yes.
beautifully well made films. I recently watched my uni screened Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore.
Yeah, that's an intense
Um,
one. Yeah.
yeah, that's what I've been writing my essay on, and I just, because I'm half American, half Palestinian, and so it talks all about the relationships between how people from the Middle East and the U.S., how that whole thing just completely changed the dynamic between the relationships and how people think about each other and different stereotypes that were created from that.
Mm.
And I was honestly in the middle of it, just like tearing up. And by the end of it, I was walking out like, I don't even know how to feel about myself because because I'm from both sides, from both parties. And
Yeah.
so I went and I talked to my lecturer about that after, actually, and it was just, even now, even writing an essay on it, it's like I still don't know how I feel about this, because some things about both parties make me really upset, and then other things it's like, how could this be possible? How could people do this?
Yeah.
But um just in general, that was probably the turning point for me when I realized, actually, if done well, documentaries can be very, very powerful. And I'd never had a documentary make me feel that way walking out of the
Mm.
theater. And so that's what's given me some motivation and some hope with creating my own, because if I can feel that way and have such an identity crisis by the end of watching one, I feel like it would be a really good experience to go out and try and create one of my own, which um, also gets someone's real perspective and real um, experiences from life. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like, you need to be very careful with documentary, especially when it comes to ethics and people's emotions and how much people can take, obviously. But I think that's also just really good to practice.
Yes.
Uh, and to see that on screen as well, I know for a fact it'll just be gorgeous and just lovely to see some just wholesome content on just real people. I'm just really excited about that. So hopefully it goes well, but I think from now on I'll definitely be more interested in it, and I've actually got a little list now of different documentaries that I want to watch.
Oh wow. Well, I mean, I'm
Um
excited to see this
so
one, but
yeah.
I mean, for me, just what you've said there about the authenticity, but also having art that makes you ask questions
Mhm,
as well, and that's so important. And
mhm.
yeah, well, I'm excited to what's ahead. I can't wait for you to get filming and stuff like that. So in closing, I just want to say thank you so much for
Yeah.
today. You did amazingly. It was incredible,
Mhm.
and like I say, free
Yeah, thank
absolute.
you.
No, thank you. I mean, you give me your time, and that means so much. But absolutely cracking choices. Before we go, is there
Mhm.
anywhere where you want people to follow you, or do you want people to leave you alone, or is it? Yeah, is there anywhere?
Um, I think I'm okay, honestly, but
Yeah,
if
no, that's
anyone
fine.
wants to follow me on Instagram, if you like what I've talked about, then by all means go ahead.
Brilliant.
Um,
Well, no,
but yeah.
that was absolutely wonderful. And yeah, well, thank you so much. And
Mhm.
yeah, listen, have a wonderful day, and I'll be seeing you soon.